could tell you the things that land on my desk all the time right now, due to increased enforcement in certain states. I'd say corporate practice issues would be one of them. The other one, I mean, it's all data, right? It's all data. There isn't a day that goes by where there isn't a data question or data issue, and there's always the kind of the HIPAA, the sort of data breach stuff, privacy policies and security policies that every covered entity needs to have. You talk a lot to some people, and anything private equity is bad, and I just think that's really short-sighted. There are situations in which private equity is bad, right? I mean, but that's
Right.
because of overreach, and that's because of they're not doing it right. But private equity brings capital to certain organizations, to healthcare, that really gives them the resources needed to to increase quality of care, being in compliance with all the relevant rules as you cross state lines. And so there are a number of ways that practices handle that. I mean, kind of the operationally complex way is to handle it on a case by case basis or on a state by state basis. I think that's tough. In my experience, what most practices opt for is taking the most restrictive state, or the state that requires the most in terms of compliance, and applying that across the board.
Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to Scaling Practice Management, the show where we help practice managers grow smarter, not harder. My name is Jakub Grajcar. I'm the head of marketing at Talk AI, where we help medical practices stop the phone from ringing off the hook and unburden their front desk team with our AI medical receptionist agents. And we're already helping over 300,000 unique patients every month. My guest today is John Rhodes. John, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I love to record these episodes. Do you often get to be on the other side of the mic aside from hosting your own podcast?
Very, very few. Yeah, this is only maybe second or third that I've done.
Ah, lovely, lovely. I'm honored. And I'm sure we're going to have a great episode today. So, a little bit of context about John for you watchers and listeners. John is a healthcare attorney and the founder of Health Law Counsel in Denver. He represents everyone from hospitals and health tech companies to urgent care centers, behavioral health providers, and independent practices, helping them navigate the maze of federal and state healthcare regulation. And that definitely is a maze we're going to at least partially explore today. John also hosts the Health Law Pulse podcast, which is why I mentioned being on the other side of the mic. And today we're here to walk practice leaders through how to scale without stepping on a legal landmine, basically, and to share tips all around that. So, to begin, John, and to ease us into this, we're going to play the warm up game. The traditional warm up game. This show has
All right.
two traditions: the warm up game and the number one tip question. So, for the warm up game, to decide the first question you're going to get, we're going to pick a category, and we're going to pick numbers, and then you're going to pick a category. So, for the numbers, please pick 3 numbers from 1 to 10.
Any numbers? Let's 3 and 7, and let's go 10.
3, 7, and 10. So I'm gonna say 3 categories to you. You pick the category and you get the question. The
Okay.
categories you have to choose from are place or travel, talent, and movie. Which one do you want?
Let's go with place.
Place, okay. What's your favorite place in the world?
Oh, I mean, look, I've been in Colorado for 12 years. I love it here. I can't see myself leaving ever. Mountains are amazing. I grew up in Utah, right near the mountains as well, so I have a great love for the mountains. I Many years ago, I lived in Portugal, and just recently
Ooh.
went back for the first time since I moved back home, just in April, and I went there with my daughter, and still have a great love for Portugal. Was rooting for them in the World Cup. Was very disappointed when they lost, and
Ah, yeah.
but it's great. I'm still fluent in Portuguese, and I have a lot of love for the people and the culture over there.
Okay, lovely. I just realized this is like a time capsule because we don't know who's gonna win the World Cup yet.
Yeah.
But by the time this airs, probably the winner will be known. So who
Yep.
are you rooting for from the teams that remain?
Oh, that's left. Um, Geez, that's a tough one. I guess maybe Spain. I guess, although no,
Why did you say it like that?
well, because they beat Portugal, so that was a rough one.
Ah,
But
yeah,
it's hard
yeah.
to root for England. It's hard to root for France. I'm going to go with in Argentina. As a Cristiano Ronaldo guy, I'm not huge Messi fan. So I'm gonna go with Spain. I'll go with Spain.
Spain. Okay. Well, we'll see by the time this airs how people are gonna feel about that. And
That's
I'll
right.
disclose it. I'm rooting for England. Don't hate me, watchers and listeners. I just I have family there by extension. My younger brother moved there. I think it was like must be like 7 years ago. Has it already been 10? A few years ago anyway. And I'm going there also in August, so I want them all to be in a great mood when I go to London for a few days. So that's
That'll
why I
do it.
want them to win.
There you go. That'll do it.
Lovely, lovely. I wasn't expecting to talk about the World Cup on this episode, but that's nice. That's what the warm-up question is for, to add a little bit of spontaneity to the show. But now for something that's very, very predictable, and everybody who knows the show knows what's coming next. The second tradition of the show is that the number one tip question is the one we always begin with. So, John, what is your number one tip for successfully growing a healthcare practice? From your perspective as a healthcare attorney, I'm really curious about your answer.
I would say technology is a big piece. I don't know that healthcare practices today, especially those at scale, have to have the right tech stack in place. I've seen a number of practices that have attempted to scale without having sort of a disjointed EMR system or various technological systems that are designed to or intended to streamline operations that don't. So having the
Mm,
right tech stack in place, having the right leaders in place that really just know healthcare, I think that's a big one. And there are different areas of healthcare. It's really hard to, for example, plug someone someone who's been in pharmacy for decades and plug them into a medical practice. It doesn't really translate. I mean, some traits may translate, but the knowledge in terms of operations, it's I think it's very difficult. But in just being up on current happenings in the healthcare field, such as legal issues, data issues, AI. How do we use AI? I mean, those are the most prominent issues. So there are a lot of challenges. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later. There are a lot of challenges with respect to scaling multi-state practices. But, yeah, I mean, it's hard to get off the ground if you don't have those pieces in place.
yeah, yeah, that's great. You touched upon a few here, and I'm curious about a couple of things to go a little bit deeper. So, for example, on being up to date on current happenings, do you have some favorite sources of information for the technology piece of it, the legal piece of it, maybe the leadership piece of it? Like, what are some of the favorite sources of information or people to follow that you would recommend to the listeners?
Oh, yeah, there are so many. So, I mean, a lot of the larger law firms, will keep people posted, so you can subscribe to any of those. Go to their law firm website, and subscribe to their newsletters. They are especially the larger ones, they're pretty up to date on what's going on. CMS, so the Medicare, Medicaid, the federal agency, there are a number of listservs that you can subscribe to. If you go to the CMS website, you can get daily updates on different rules that they're publishing or proposing, and get up to date on things like that. The OIG as well, the Office of Inspector General. You get I subscribe to that. I get daily briefings on different enforcement actions or press releases the Department of Justice has, has issued or published. So there are quite a few. There are some that you can subscribe to, like Lexis and things like that, which I do. Modern Healthcare is a great source as well. But yeah, there are a lot of places to go to get that information.
Okay, I love that. We're gonna link to those in the show notes just to make it easier to find, dear watchers and listeners. So go there, go to the show notes. Don't forget to also, subscribe and follow and rate us while you're there, in the interface on Spotify, Apple, or whichever, or on YouTube. YouTube subs are my favorite. And then the other thing I wanted to follow up on from what you said is leadership, right? One of my
Mhm.
favorite topics, I'll admit, right? And this is a rabbit hole that I'm more than happy to disappear down. But just to touch upon it a little bit, because it's not the main topic for today. But what do you think are the qualities of a great leader, especially in healthcare? You mentioned this, subject matter expertise through your lens is an important one. But what else might be on that list?
Oh, in terms of leadership, I mean, yeah, subject matter expertise is important. someone, I mean, and I've interviewed a number of clinical leaders and have asked a very similar question in terms of like, what are the common traits that you see in successful leaderships? Certainly people who are willing to listen, people who can drive have an executive presence, can really drive performance, can drive coordination, someone who's operationally sound. The thing is to really and I mean, there are so many different areas of healthcare where this could apply, but you think of a kind of a regular medical practice. Let's just take a primary care practice. It's really tough to coordinate the total care of a patient in that silo, right? So in a primary care, because a patient could have so many different comorbidities, could require specialty care, could require behavioral health care, mental, therapy, things like that. And so the ability to coordinate successfully with other provider types in a way that is cost effective, that's a big
Yeah.
one. Cost effective and best for the patient is huge. So someone who's really well organized and someone who can drive those factors in treating the whole health of a patient or I mean, they're critical.
Yeah, yeah, that's really intriguing. Almost sounds like an episode in itself. And I definitely want to also ask you about, the learnings from your podcast in just a bit. Let's put a pin in this for just a second. And thank you for answering the number one tip question. And now, so that people know a little bit more about where you're coming from, why don't you tell us more about, your business, Health Law Counsel? You opened it, I think, a year and a half ago or so. So what made you, set out on your own? And what kind of practices do you spend most of your days helping?
Yeah. So I opened up Health Law Counsel LLC in February of 2025, so almost exactly a year and a half ago. I've been practicing law and healthcare for almost 20 years. I've been in a couple of different positions with law firms, always in healthcare. A couple different in-house roles, also just in healthcare with a couple different provider types. Most recently, I led the Walmart Health legal team, and we were putting in primary care practices, dental practices, in clinics. And this is sort of at the boon of the retail healthcare movement. Walmart Health was doing it, CVS, Walgreens, they're all kind of expanding their healthcare offerings. And Walmart decided not to, they didn't want to pursue Walmart Health anymore. So I stuck around for a little bit while longer just to kind of wind things down. But it gave me about, I'd say, a year to really be thoughtful about what I wanted to do in the next phase or chapter of my career. Going out on my own is something I thought about in the past. I just never really felt like I had the time to develop the infrastructure I felt like I needed to get it off the ground and hit the ground running. But they really Walmart made it about as soft as landing as you could possibly have, and so it really
That's cool.
afforded me the opportunity to be thoughtful about this and to let people know what I was doing, develop the website, all the stuff that's required to get things going. So I really was able to hit the ground running, which was fantastic, and I've enjoyed it. In terms of what I've been doing the last year and a half, it's certainly in my entire legal career the most diverse healthcare practice that I've ever had. I represent all kinds of provider types and healthcare companies, from large health systems to small startups, medical practice startups, behavioral health startups, to health tech companies. A couple of different AI companies that are solely in the healthcare space, or at least have a foot in the healthcare space. And so yeah, it's a little across the board. Everything from regulatory, I'd say historically, I'm a healthcare regulatory lawyer, so fraud, waste, and abuse, kickback, start type stuff. But we do certainly do a lot more than that. We do compliance, reimbursement, corporate structuring of medical practices to comply with specific state laws and requirements. So a little bit of everything, but yeah, always just in healthcare. That's the name, Health Law Counsel.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting, and a lot of threads to pull on for a podcast host such as myself. I need to make the right decisions here. But one thing I'm definitely curious about, and I think a lot of the listeners are gonna be about as well, is okay. So on the Walmart Health legal team, right? That sounds like huge scale to operate on, and I wonder what that was like. What that taught you. Can you say anything more about that? Just take us into that.
So, it was amazing, and, certainly, we were trying to develop the platform to increase access to care, right? And, there were a number of reasons why it maybe it didn't work out or it just wasn't the right timing, but, certainly, the idea was to take on risk in for the total health of a patient, right? So, and the idea
Okay.
was coordinated care. We had a virtual care platform. I think the statistic is 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart. So,
Mhm,
great
mm.
platform for access to care purposes along when you have a virtual care component, that just adds to that the increased access. So, you're trying to coordinate primary care with dental and, the kind of the diet side. They got the food side already, they got the pharmacy. That was the idea was to coordinate that, and I think we're doing a really good job of that. Nothing
Yeah.
nothing but great things to say about it. Just a wonderful, wonderful experience. I learned that I mean, I already knew this, but healthcare is very complicated, and, and trying to coordinate that care is really hard. It's just it's very difficult. But that said, there are a lot of great learnings from that, and, hopefully, at some point, whether it's Walmart or someone else, someone with a huge platform to really drive increased access to care, I think that's really important. I think it'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. So one last question about that. You mentioned, the learnings from that chapter. So what might be one of them? What did you learn about like handling that complexity of healthcare from that, point of view?
It requires, to make it cost effective and to make it, sort of seamless, from the perspective of the patient, it requires an enormous amount of organization. It requires an enormous amount of, uh, workforce to really the right tech, to have everything in place to coordinate that care. There's just a ton of coordination involved, right? Because you're not gonna have one provider that can handle all the healthcare needs of a patient. Not not usually. I mean, sometimes, but, it's really complicated because you've got, a lot of times this is driven by primary care. So primary care can take care of a certain component, but they're not therapists, they're not oncologists, they're not cardiologists. So it requires a ton of coordination. With these other specialty providers. And then I'm a huge advocate for preventative care. So the idea of what can we do to keep patients out of the hospital, because that's the most expensive part of healthcare is our hospital stays, and that's why things like readmissions and length of stay at the hospital. Those are huge metrics.
Yeah.
That are tracked is so important because of the costs involved. And so preventative from a social determinants of health, recognizing and acknowledging that, we need to treat the person and their circumstance over the symptoms to really, change the health of an individual. That's so important. So, a lot of we explore this on my podcast, but, talking about, okay, what does that mean? How do we treat the whole health of a patient? How do we get away from just treating symptoms and then not doing anything until they come back and then treat the symptoms again. So it's so complicated, but it's a lot of fun. So there's I don't know if there's a right way to do it, but I mean, to me, preventative care, social determinants of health, sort of driving that coordination of care, those are all, critical pieces to cost effective healthcare.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for expanding on that. And it's clear that you're very passionate about this. I love to hear about this. In terms of preventative, I think that the saying is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? I remember
Yeah,
that much.
absolutely.
So, uh, but next, though, let's get into the kind of the legal meat and potatoes of what we were meaning to talk about today. So, I often say this to potential guests, as we're preparing for these episodes, because watchers and listeners behind the scenes, sometimes we do have a preparatory call to make the episode as good as possible for you guys, for you folks. So let's look at the lay of the land, right? If you were standing in front of a room and there's 1,000 practice managers and owners in there, and from a legal standpoint, then what are the top compliance risks you tell them to actually worry about right now, in the current state of things, the types of problems that just keep landing on your desk and you wish more people were aware, or maybe there's a way to prevent them, as we just mentioned, and not have them land on your desk. What would you
Yeah.
say to that?
Kind of the typical ones are always there. We always worry about, Medicare compliance, kickback type arrangements. So those are always going to be there. I could tell you the things that land on my desk all the time right now, due to increased enforcement in certain states. I'd say corporate practice issues would be one of them. The other one, I mean, it's all data, right? It's all data. There isn't a day that goes by where there isn't a data question or data issue, and there's always the kind of the HIPAA, the sort of data breach stuff, privacy policies and security policies that every covered entity needs to have. But, what do you do with data? How can you use data? What are you prohibited from doing with data? And this isn't just a healthcare issue, right? I mean, this is everywhere. There's all these organizations have a ton of data, and there's a proliferation of state data there's no federal privacy law, right? There's HIPAA. There are a few
Uh-huh.
others that are targeted at specific areas, but there isn't a national federal privacy law. So it's handled by the states, and so every state's a little bit different in terms of what's restricted, what are the requirements, opt in, opt out, things like that. But and using even vendors of healthcare clients or healthcare organizations that want to use data to develop their own AI tools. Like everyone's trying to develop their own AI tool. So,
Mm.
what does that look like? Yeah, you got companies that are getting into prior authorization, clinical decision support software, which is certainly at the top of the FDA's list of things to look at. So,
Yeah.
I'd say that was a long way of answering your question, but yeah, I'd say corporate practice of medicine
Mhm.
issues and data, AI data type privacy issues.
Yeah, yeah, and I think both of those are interesting places to go. Let's start with the first one. So, corporate practice of medicine. Do you think you could break this down for us? So, what kind of situations do you mean here, and what should medical practices know about that?
Yeah. So corporate practice of medicine rules. It's a state law issue. There are different laws that cover optometry and dental and things like that. I'm just talking about medicine. So corporate practice of medicine. There are 33 states that have some form of prohibition against the corporate practice of medicine. So it could mean a number of things. Number one, it could mean that a non-physician cannot own a medical practice. That's one way. That's one prohibition, that's within that bucket, that corporate practice bucket. The other would be, a non-physician or a non-professional entity can't hire a physician to provide medical services. So meaning, like, I have an LLC, I'm not a physician, I can't hire a doctor and pay this doctor to provide medical services, right? I mean, it's gotta be a physician-owned entity that does that. And then the third would be a non-physician entity-owned entity. You can't essentially make it look like you're practicing medicine. So you can't convey to the folks like a reasonable person should be able to look at your organization and think, "Oh, I don't know, Boeing is, they can't practice medicine," or whatever non-healthcare entity can't practice medicine because and the reason behind that is, these states that prohibit it, they don't want non-physicians to impact or influence the professional judgment of the clinician, right, of the physician. So
Right.
whether that's a profit, money motive, or whatever the case may be, that professional judgment of the physician needs to remain independent. So that's the overarching premise behind these corporate practice of medicine rules.
Yeah. So I understand the rules that you just laid out, and yet we do have this whole world of like private equity owned, quote unquote, owned practices,
Yep.
and MSOs and all of that. So how is that actually being done, and how does that relate to the rules that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so a common model in healthcare is what's known as I mean, it's known by many names, the MSO-PC model, the friendly PC model, captive PC model. PC
Okay.
meaning professional corporation, MSO being a management services organization. So a common way to comply with corporate practice rules in those states that prohibit it is you have a management company, an MSO, that enters into a management agreement with a physician-owned practice, physician-owned professional entity, and the MSO provides everything non-clinical that you need to run the practice. It'll provide the space, it'll provide the tech stack, it'll provide the non-clinical personnel, everything that needs to operate the practice. And then the PC is owned by a friendly physician, a physician that's friendly to the MSO. And the physician is the one that's responsible for driving the clinical operations of the practice. And that's how the MSO gets through its management fee, gets revenue out of the PC, and that's how it's done. So when you think about private equity in healthcare and owning practices, well, they typically do not own the practice itself. They own the management company or the MSO, and that MSO has a management agreement with a professional corporation that's closely tied to the MSO.
Right. So the MSO has kind of practices and physicians in their roster. Okay, I may have a little bit of an outsider perspective on this, but it feels like there might still be a little bit of a misalignment of incentives still, right, in that model. So I wonder how how this breaks down in terms of so this friendly PC, the physician-owned entity here, does it have enough independence? Is this why the states might be cracking down on this a little bit more? I'm just trying to kind of build a landscape of
Yeah.
what's happening in this space right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the argument against the MSO-PC model, which is, probably where a number of ways that MSOs maybe get this wrong. Number one, probably not taking corporate practice issues seriously enough. And
Okay.
you're right. A number of states, that's a law that's on the books. It's maybe it's not hardly ever enforced. There are other states that there's active litigation. It is heavily enforced. California is a good example of that. Oregon, Texas is another one. So some of the bigger states do have active enforcement on corporate practice issues. And so that, like, not taking compliance seriously enough. The second piece is, maybe the MSOs, there's some overreach, right? So the overreach in terms of physician-owned entity, you have to see X number of patients a day, right? Or an MSO driving clinical protocols, driving schedules, driving, anything that's clinically related that really should be left to the physician. Then when there's some overreach there, I think that's where it gets to be a bit problematic. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of arguments against it, and there's the compliance piece in terms of, how do we comply with the statute, and then there's the operations pieces, which is equally or more important than the actual, complying with the actual letter of the law. How do we operationalize this in a way that reduces risk and isn't perceived as overreach by the MSO or or private equity group?
Yeah, yeah. It feels like a matter of striking a sort of balance here is how I'm getting this. I'm curious, how does that actually affect the practice itself, right? So does that mean is this something that even touches, like, an independent practice in some way that this is happening? Is it going to make it more difficult to sell a practice, for example? Because the MSOs are gonna be kind of more, if there's more enforcement, they're not gonna be so keen to add practices. I'm guessing here, I would love for you to tell me what's actually happening and what the actual meaning of this is for independent practices or the ones that are already under an MSO. Do things change?
I don't know that the increased enforcement in certain states has really slowed down the some of the M&A work in this MSO-PC model. I don't think so. Maybe to a certain extent in those states, but overall across the country, I don't know that it's necessarily slowed down. I mean, look, if it's done correctly, I think there's a lot of benefits to healthcare by having this model. I think increased capital in healthcare is a good thing, and the NSO is able to do that. Private equity is able to do that. Now, if we're able to operationalize that without the overreach, right? I mean, that's the key. Then that's that would be the big piece there. But in terms of MSOs slowing down in acquisitions, or how does it affect current, practices that are within the MSO? I don't know that it does very much right now. We'll have to see how, California is a good example. There's a case before the California Court of Appeals that's pending that sort of, to a certain extent, will kind of drive the future of corporate practice rules in California. So
Okay.
we're gonna have to see how that plays out, but that's just in California, and we'll have to, yeah, obviously, we're gonna do whatever we can to comply with whatever the rules are there, but, I think healthcare is still moving forward, and it's just a matter of getting the compliance piece right and getting the right controls in place to ensure that we're keeping this as a low-risk structure.
Okay, interesting. I'm curious about that case you mentioned. Okay, you mentioned it's in California, of course. If somebody's there, that's going to be more pertinent to them, but other states might see it as a precedent. So can you tell us more about that?
I believe the case is Art Center Holdings, and I don't remember exactly the facts of the case, but it's essentially there are a number of documents that are pretty common to the MSO-PC model. One of them is called the Security Transaction Restriction Agreement. And that essentially says, "Hey, owner of the PC, you can't go out and go rogue and just, sell the PC, your interest in the PC to anyone you want, to any other physician. You have to
Mhm.
run it by the MSO essentially has to approve." So there are certain situations in which the MSO would be able to replace the shareholder. There, number of triggers in which that would happen. So California, the Attorney General, there are a number of investigations going on out there, out in California, of organizations that have this model and they have a pretty strong position that these STRAs violate the corporate practice rules in California. So this case right now that's pending for the California Court of Appeals is essentially asking them to make that decision. Does an STRA in and of itself violate corporate practice rules in California? So if they determine that it does, then we're going to have to kind of figure that out. But it may weaken the MSO-PC structure a little bit out there. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, so what are the two possibilities here? I mean, I assume maybe there's more than two, right? It's nuanced, right? But in terms of whether these are deemed to violate the corporate practice law or not, so what are the two possible scenarios we might find ourselves in?
Well, one being that they decide that they're not. I mean, this is within the purview of it. It's deciding who, under certain circumstances, the authority by the MSO to replace a PC shareholder is not the practice of medicine. It doesn't violate the corporate practice rules of California. That's one option. The other option is they say it does, and if they say it does, and then there will be some adjustments likely to STRAs in California, and kind of lessen the authority and the power of an MSO to replace a shareholder. The restrictions on what a shareholder could do with his or her interests in the practice could be weakened or strengthened. The MSO would have less authority there, and so yeah, I mean, we'd have to adjust and make some changes to those STRAs, but that is a possible outcome.
Okay, really interesting. Um, okay, I'm almost curious to ask you what kind of outcome do you personally root for here, but I don't know. That's a good question to ask. Wait, is it?
Well, I mean, I am rooting for, I mean, certainly rooting for them to not rule that STRAs violate the corporate practice of medicine rule, because I think STRAs serve an important function if it's drafted correctly and if it's structured correctly, right? I mean, again, we talked about some of the benefits of the MSO-PC model. What happens if, let's say, a physician shareholder is just kinda goes off the rails or rogue and just starts running the practice in a way that just makes no sense. I mean, there are certain guardrails against that from a medical board perspective, right? But then the MSO suffers and the patients suffer, and so, overall quality of care suffers, and so there are a number of reasons I think the STR it's good to have the STRA. Now, can there be overreach? Sure. We talked a little bit about that, and so it's gotta be structured in a way to strike that balance to ensure that the MSO is not driving clinical protocols. That's important. I'm an advocate for that. It should be the physician, it should be the practice. but also, the MSO to kind of protect the patients and to protect the whole structure itself needs to have the ability to not control is not the right word, but be able to, have a shareholder in there that's willing to, kinda grow that practice and increase quality of care of the patients.
Understood, understood. Okay, thanks for expanding on that. So the last thing I'm curious about here is why is this happening now? This increased enforcement of corporate law of medicine. Why is now the moment when this is such a hot topic?
Well, I mean, some of it's political, just like, unfortunately, I hate the fact that healthcare is a political topic, but it is. So some of it's political, for sure. Some of it, I mean, there's been such a exponential growth of private equity's involvement in healthcare over the last 5 to 10 years that I think that's spurred some of this. Some of the legislation at the state level is directed specifically at private equity, and, others, it's much broader than that. But I think the increased involvement of private equity has spurred some of this. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it's also very political. I think, the political tides go back and forth and,
Of course.
so right now we're in a place where some of these states are, for a number of reasons, have decided to increase enforcement there. But, yeah, there are a number of reasons, but, just like everything else, everything goes back and forth. So I
Yeah.
suspect this will
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, I think there's a subset of people, they just hear the words private equity and they're gonna say, whatever they want, that's what I don't want, right? And, people see that in very much black and white terms, but the truth of the matter is often very much, more gray, and there's incentives and nuances to consider on all sides of the equation. Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you for,
agreed.
I'm tempted to once again say thank you for expanding on that, and I feel like I'm overusing that in this episode. But anyway, the next thing I wanted to move on to if I may, is wait, did you want to add more on top of that?
Well, the only thing I was gonna say, just to piggyback on what you just said, I agree that you talk a lot to some people, and anything private equity is bad, and I just think that's really short-sighted. There are situations in which private equity is bad, right? I mean, but that's
Right.
because of overreach, and that's because of, they're not doing it right. But private equity brings capital to certain organizations, to healthcare, that really gives them the resources needed to increase quality of care. So, there is not all private equity companies are bad. Some
Yeah,
private equities just don't do it right, but I think there are positives to it. But I think you're right. I think if you talk to some people, say, yeah, this is great. Other people, you hear the term private equity and they're totally turned off, and it's kind of the
exactly.
evil corporate greed and all that, which isn't always true.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, at the end of the day, these are entities investing in healthcare. That can be a good thing. I don't think it's a radical thing to say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Exactly. Cool, cool. All right. So the next thing I was meaning to ask about is let's go back to scaling. Let's go back to the topic of the show, right? So one other thing that we mentioned, again, as we were preparing for this episode, that I definitely wanted to touch upon is what would we say to the practices that are scaling right now and they're about to cross a state line? They're opening new locations, they're doing great, they're growing, and they're thinking, okay, I'm close to a state border here, and the next one is going to be in a neighboring state. You mentioned that to some extent you've seen those cases, you know what it takes. So talk to the practices that are in this sort of situation from a legal standpoint, from a scaling standpoint. What should they watch out for?
It certainly adds complexity, right, to the practice, and it's because the laws from state to state can vary so much. And so when we're talking about, some of the easier things like record retention for medical records, that can vary from state to state. Some of the, I don't know, informed consent requirements, things like that. So from an patient intake standpoint, it's always good to look at what are the state laws, what are the requirements, what are the documentation requirements, things like that. The bigger ones are things like the supervision rules for nurse practitioners or physician assistants. Most multi-state practices, if maybe not all of them, are pretty heavily invested in APPs, or advanced practice practitioners. So, they have, NP models or PA models in which you have a lot of nurse practitioners that are actually on the ground seeing patients that are supervised by physicians. Every state has their own physician supervision rules. Some states require physicians to meet with the nurse practitioners on a I don't know, monthly, quarterly basis. Some don't. Some require for the physician to review X number of charts every month that a nurse practitioner completes, and others don't. So they vary greatly, and so I think it's important to understand that. What are those supervision requirements? Licensure requirements vary from state to state. That's another one. Data privacy issues. That's another one. So there's HIPAA, but HIPAA doesn't cover everything. So state data privacy issues, how what data are you collecting on your websites? Do you what kind of disclaimers, what are you collecting? What's your opt-in or opt-out mechanism? Every state's a little bit different. And so it just adds a lot of complexity to being in compliance with all the relevant rules as you cross state lines. And so there are a number of ways that practices handle that. I mean, kind of the operationally complex way is to handle it on a case by case basis or on a state by state basis. I think that's tough. I think what in my experience, what most practices opt for is taking the most restrictive state or the state that requires the most in terms of compliance and applying that across the board. So you are essentially you have a streamlined operational process to comply with all these relevant rules, and you're able to and you're able to apply that across the board and be in compliance with every state you're in. So uh, telehealth is another one. Every state has their own telehealth rules. I mean, there are some national components to that, but every state has their own. Like, when does that provider-patient relationship begin? It's just it's those are all things that at least you need to pay attention to if you're going into another state.
Yeah, you anticipated one of my questions here because I was thinking, I mean, I'm a marketer. One thing I know is websites, right? So I was wondering if it would be the case where, the opt-in laws for data privacy are different in certain states. Like, do you detect the IP where the user is coming from? And then depending on the state, you serve them a different consent form. Or what you're saying is you pick the most restrictive one and then you serve that form to all the states because then you're covered in all of them, but because you took the most restrictive one.
So practices handle it differently. That is one way to do it, and frankly, it could depend on how many states you're in. There could be like if you're in all 50 states, maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. It sort of depends on the rules and exactly what you're doing. Maybe you don't collect data on your website, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, it just sort of depends. A lot of practices I've worked with have opted to do that, but not every practice is in all 50 states, and maybe it's just 4 or 5, so it's a little bit easier. And once you get into 50 states, maybe you will have 1 or 2 that are just so far off from the rest that you have a process just for those 2
Yeah.
states, and then a common one for the rest. And so it just sort of depends on the rules and how many states you're in and what you're actually doing.
Out of the different complexities you mentioned, what are the ones that most often catch practices off guard? Like, I had no idea that I also needed to take care of this aspect before I open in a different state.
So the one that comes across most often is a supervision one.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
you can have, like, you can have nurse practitioners in 10 different states trying to find, supervising physicians for each of them and accommodating the different rules in each of those states. That's one that comes up. And then the question of, are you gonna prescribe controlled substances? And if so, what are the requirements for that? Like, are there different some states have different supervision rules if you're gonna prescribe controlled substances. And so, yeah, I think that's the one that, I don't know if it catches people by surprise, but it is one that I think is the most difficult to streamline operationally.
I mean, I can't help but think this is definitely a strong argument to work with somebody like you, right? Who can guide through all of that legal complexity, a healthcare attorney. But I wanted to ask you, other than a healthcare attorney, what do you think are some of the, entities, organizations, specialists to work with in this sort of situation? Because it feels like maybe this isn't something you can necessarily do alone as a practice. So who else might help out?
Yeah, it's a great question. It sort of depends on what you got going on. So there are a number of organizations out there that help with healthcare consulting and scaling and managing practices. It kind of depends on what if you're trying to procure a specific license for what you're doing. There are consulting companies out there that help you, get all the policies and procedures and everything you need in place in order to get that license. One thing that one of the big requirements in healthcare is, from a kickback standpoint and from a Stark law standpoint, is this concept of fair market value. Like every whether it's transaction or compensation or whatever it is, it needs to be an arm's length transaction, fair market value. So there are a lot of organizations out there that will provide or have valuation experts that will help you determine what is fair market value for certain services or assets. That's a big one. There's a lot of data analytic healthcare. There are a number that I've worked with that if you're trying to get into the analytics of data, how you're using data, where data is
Yeah.
going, data flow, there are a number of organizations out there that help do that specifically in healthcare. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of organizations out there. I think from a understanding the legal landscape, I would certainly recommend getting some sort of legal guidance of people who are familiar with the space. But outside of that, in terms of scaling, in terms of fair market value, where I'm not an expert in any of that, and so
Yeah.
definitely, we can we refer people to those organizations all the time. So there are definitely reasons to look up those other organizations for those needs.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about finding some consulting support. Typically, there's a whole network of possible
Yeah,
referrals for different kinds of problems, right? Yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
I know all about that. And so you already mentioned data more than once, so definitely that's one of the last stops I wanted to take on during this conversation. So let's talk about data and AI. I think some practices right now, I mean, a lot of practices are thinking, how to comply with data laws, especially as these data and privacy laws are changing all the time. At the same time, some of them are thinking about adopting AI, and some feel enthusiastic about it and want to do it, but they want to do it right, also from a legal standpoint. So, can you say, I mean, this is pretty broadly stated, but can you talk more about that? How to comply with the data laws, how to work, from a legal standpoint, how to work well with an AI company. What is your take on that?
That's a good question. I think it sort of depends on what you're wanting to do with the data, and what the data is. So, I the first question I have when this comes up with clients is, what is your institutional position on what can or can't be done with your de-identified data, right? So, if we're talking about a healthcare organization that's governed by HIPAA, the data is identifiable, it has protected health information. You're pretty restricted on what you can and can't do with that data. Now, if data is truly de-identified in a way that HIPAA regulations say it has to be, then it's no longer protected health information, and there's a lot more you can do with it. However, just because you can do stuff with data doesn't mean you necessarily want to. And so the question that comes up all the time is, let's say a healthcare like a hospital enters into an agreement with some vendor. Well, a lot of vendors now are developing their own AI tools. So the first thing I'll ask the hospital when we're negotiating an agreement, and there's some data provision in there, is, well, what is your position on what they can and can't do with your de-identified data, right? So then there are a lot of legal issues surrounding what can't be done with de-identified data, but you may not want the hospital may not want other people to use your data because there's real value in that to help them or to help other customers, to help other clients. And so, number one,
Right.
what's your institutional position on what you want or don't want to be done with your de-identified data? The other piece is governance. Governance is so important when it comes to AI use and comes to data use. So data governance meaning, okay, we have an opportunity with such and such to collaborate with this partner, having a structured process in place for the right people to approve what can and can't be done with that data. You know, you got to know. You got to know where your data is going, what they're doing with it, and the right people have to be in place to approve that or not. So governance is a big one. And then there's the if we're talking about health tech companies that are using AI, it's the compliance with whatever you're doing. If it's an AI chatbot, there are increased amount of state laws that govern what has to be disclosed, not disclosed with
Yeah,
AI
yeah.
chatbot. There's that piece. There's also are you developing a platform that provides clinical decision support? Well, I mean, the FDA has issued guidance on what is a regulated medical device in this area and what isn't. So what do you have to do in developing this platform for it not to be a regulated medical device by the FDA? And so that gets a little tricky. Prior authorizations, that's the other thing. It's, an AI tool, you wanna there's been prior authorization has been a controversial topic for a long, long time with insurance companies, and making sure that the platform isn't biased in any way, that it's totally objective, that it's being checked by a human, things like that, that it's, we don't wanna increase. I don't think companies wanna increase denials of care because they're
Right.
using an AI platform that, is denying all these prior authorization requests. And so, there's just so much that goes into it, from governance to just having positions and policies on what you want done with your data, to the actual platform themselves in compliance with the applicable rules and laws surrounding those. So there's so many layers to it.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. One piece I definitely wanted to touch upon from what you mentioned is the AI specific laws. Part of as we were building the Talkie AI receptionist was, one of the decisions was the receptionist always has to identify itself. The AI agent always has to identify itself at the beginning. I am an AI assistant. I am an AI receptionist. Right, very clearly at the very beginning, so there's no doubt about what sort of conversation is being had here. And initially that was just a transparency decision, but now also to some extent it's becoming part of the legal layer of it all, right? So it's good
Right.
to, I mean, from our perspective, of course, it's good to be kind of ahead of the trend here. But all in all,
Yep.
even personally, I do agree that if you're speaking with an AI, that should be disclosed. It should be clear, especially now that the the voice synthesis is so good that you can't really discern easily, especially over the phone that you're speaking with,
Right.
not with a human, right? So it's an important aspect to keep in mind here. I guess you mentioned a ton of layers from this data aspect of it. I wonder if there's anything you would point to as like the very first step to start untangling that, because definitely we don't unfortunately have time today to solve all the data problems of all the practices. But what do you think is a sensible start?
Two things. So, number one, if you don't know where your data is, where it lives, where it's going, how it's being used, I think, and surprisingly, I mean, you think that more organizations would know this. I bet there's so much data out there.
Yeah.
It can be tough. It can be tough to know that. So, getting a handle on that, I think, is number one. Number two, being that sort of making those institutional decisions on how you are wanting or not wanting your data to be used. And I know I mentioned 2, but 3 is the governance piece. I think is so important. So I think really, I mean, those are really kind of the basics, just knowing where your data is, how you want it to use, how you want it used and not used, and having a governance process in place for approvals. And there's just got to be some structured process in place to to understand where, how it's being used, how we don't want it being used, and have that documented. I think is critical.
Totally agreed. I think step one of many sorts of projects, but definitely in this area as well, is just to know what you have. Know, before you change anything, what's the current situation, especially as you get a little bit of scale, and you don't really need a lot of scale to start encountering this. Already, you don't know. The left hand doesn't know what the right is doing in this data aspect, right? Who's got what data? Where are they sending it, etc. So I think it's a very sensible first step, as you just mentioned. And oh gosh, I do believe we've achieved here something that's hard to do, and that's to talk about, healthcare law in a way that is going to be, I think, quite engaging for our audience, especially the audience of this show. So I wanted to thank you for that, John. I definitely learned a ton from this conversation. Many threads to follow up on, in I hope our future conversations and anything else besides. So to close off the episode, I wanted to give you a chance to tell the watchers and listeners where they can find you and follow you. And I promised I'm going to ask about the podcast. So by all means, tell the people about your podcast as well, so they can listen to yours as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been awesome. I appreciate the platform for sure, and always willing to talk about this stuff. I I often tell people I lucked into healthcare law 'cause that was not my intent when I went to law school. I didn't know anything about
Okay.
healthcare law. That was a job that I interviewed for and got out of law school, but I absolutely lucked into it 'cause it's been an awesome career and I really enjoy it very much. So, yeah, so you can find me on my website, www.healthlawcounsel.com. Probably the easiest way to do it, or, I'm on LinkedIn as well. There's links to my website, there. Yeah, Health Law Pulse, we just wrapped up our first season. We're gonna resume season 2 in September. I'm very excited for this season. We've actually got a chief health equity officer for a very large health system here that's on the docket, for us to chat. He's also the former chief medical officer for the Department of Homeland Security. So, we got a number of other great guests lined up. So very excited for that. But the idea of Health Law Pulse was really to explore different areas of healthcare. So it was not never intended to be about health law every episode. We do tackle some legal compliance issues, but we also tackle operational issues. We tackle AI data issues, clinical leadership issues. One of the first episode I had my brother on. He's
Oh,
one of
cool.
the associate deans for medical school here. So we talked about innovation and medical education here. So we try to explore different areas of healthcare. So hopefully that's appealing to a number of different folks in the healthcare area. But yeah, there are links to you can find me on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts as well. And all those links are on my website at healthlawcounsel.com.
Awesome, awesome. And we'll link to it in the show notes as well, so you can find that easily, watchers and listeners. And don't forget to like and subscribe and follow and rate both our shows, because I can recommend John's definitely as well, while you're at it. Thank you so much, John. I also very appreciate and very much enjoyed this conversation. Too bad we have to wrap up here, but hey, maybe this is the first of many. We'll see. And in the meantime, I would also like to thank you, watchers and listeners, for joining us here today. This has been Scaling Practice Management. I have been Jakub Grajcar, and I will see you next time. Bye bye, everyone.